all pilots should have a basic understanding of aerodynamics if they really want to understand how to control an aircraft. In this lesson, we're going to be continuing our study on aerodynamics because you have to know this stuff in order to become a skilled pilot and have mastery over the airplane. Thanks for joining me today on Free Pilot Training. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Josh and I'm a CFI with military flight experience in the C-130. And today I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Understanding aerodynamics made me so much better at flying to Herc because the C-130 flies just like a giant Cessna 172. Well, it has 18,000 horsepower, but the principles are basically the same other than that. And when I really started understanding this topic, it really helped me to understand how to put the airplane right where I wanted during a lot of different situations. If it can do that for me, it can do it for you too. So let's dive in and talk about aerodynamics. In the last lesson, one of the things we talked about was stalls. But what would happen if you stalled an airplane and the tail of the aircraft was not aligned with its direction of travel? Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that the airplane could enter a spin. And if you're flying at a low altitude when the airplane spins, you better hope you're high enough above the ground to recover before you die. Because you will probably die if this happens. Now, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to explain how serious these things are. Because if you can understand this, you're going to know how to prevent them so there won't be anything at all to worry about when you're out flying with your grandma. Because she's going to have so much fun not dying that she'll bake you cookies when you land. Boy, cookies sound really good right now. Anyway, according to the FAA, a spin is something that can happen to an airplane in an aggravated stall if you mishandle the yaw axis during that stall. Anytime these two things happen, this increases your chance of spinning the airplane. This means that the airplane barrels towards the ground while following a scary corkscrew path. Not a fun time. Unless, of course, you're spinning the airplane on purpose. In that case, Grandma might like that. But anyway, you might be asking yourself, what the heck is an aggravated stall, and how on earth could I mishandle the yaw axis? Well, one thing at a time. Let's talk about the aggravated stall first. If you remember from the last lesson, one of the things I told you was that when the wings hit their critical angle of attack and the airplane stalls, the wings are still creating some lift, but not enough to overcome the weight of the aircraft. But if the airspeed continues to deteriorate and if the angle of attack continues to increase, your wings are going to be producing even less lift. In fact, most airplanes these days are actually designed with a slight twist in each wing so that the wing root is always at a higher angle of attack than the wingtip. This means that your wing root will stall first and you'll lose lift a lot more gradually. Because of this inner part of the wing could be completely stalled while your wingtip out here would still be holding up the airplane. But in an aggravated stall, the whole wing becomes stalled and drops like a sack of potatoes. That's why it's so important for you to learn how to identify when your airplane is getting close to a stall. This is what we call an impending stall. And during an impending stall, you'll hear the stall horn on a Cessna 172. On a Piper Cherokee, you'll see the stall light if the bulb hasn't burned out. Boy, that would be bad, wouldn't it? But then on almost all airplanes, you'll get wing buffeting right before the wings drop. This is the reason why one of the first things you're going to learn during your flight training is stall recovery. First, we want you to be able to tell that the airplane is about to stall and keep that from happening. But we also want you to be able to recover the airplane if it does stall for one reason or another. But the big thing that's going to make recovery difficult is if you're mishandling the yaw axis like we talked about a second ago. This simply means that the tail of the airplane is not aligned with the airplane's direction of travel. What happens if you're driving a car and the back end skids out and the car isn't straight with the direction of travel? Yeah, the car can be difficult to control, can't it? And airplanes are the same way. We need the air to flow over all the control surfaces evenly on both sides so we can control it correctly. That's why you have an inclinometer in your airplane. This is a curved little tube with a ball in it. And if you can't remember the name inclinometer, almost all pilots call this the ball. And if the ball isn't centered when you're out flying around, the tail of your airplane is not aligned with the airplane's direction of travel. Sometimes you'll hear pilots refer to this condition as a slip or a skid, depending on which direction the tail has moved. And if you don't keep that under control, this means that you're mishandling the yaw axis. And this can make the airplane more difficult to control, especially if you're moving really slow or if you've stalled the airplane. And that's where things can get really hairy. If you're in a stall, it's already going to be difficult to control the airplane. But if the air isn't flowing over the wings evenly during a stall, it could be impossible to control the airplane. That's why your instructor is going to be an absolute pain in the neck during your flight training. He's going to be constantly telling you to look at the ball or step on the ball because he's trying to get you to develop a habit for keeping the nose aligned with the tail at all times. So if you do stall, you won't even have to think about it. Your nose is already going to be aligned. And this is what we're talking about when we say that we want the airplane to be coordinated. The tail is aligned with the airplane's direction of travel. Now, I know I'm going to catch some heat for this, but I truly believe that it's almost impossible to spin an airplane that's coordinated. And here's why I believe that. Listen to what the Airplane Flying Handbook says. A spin occurs when at least one of the airplane's wings exceed the critical angle of attack or stalls, with the side slip or yaw acting on the airplane at or beyond the actual stall. Now, they do go on to say that this yaw is not necessarily caused by using the rudder incorrectly. It can also be caused because you're not accounting for adverse yaw that's caused by the ailerons. That's why it's super important for you to always, always, always fly the aircraft as if the rudder pedals are tied to the ailerons, unless, of course, you're intentionally trying to slip the aircraft. Anytime you roll the airplane, you're creating more drag on the wing with the lowered aileron, and this will actually cause the airplane to yaw in the direction of that lowered aileron. This is why it does not matter which wing stalls first, or even if both wings stall at the same time. If your airplane spins, it's going to spin in the direction of the yaw. Let me read you what the Airplane Flying Handbook says. A stall that occurs while the airplane is in a slipping or skidding turn can result in a spin entry and rotation in the direction of the rudder application, regardless of which wingtip is raised. If the pilot does not immediately initiate stall recovery, the airplane may enter a spin. And that raises an important question. What should you do if you think the airplane is about to spin? It hasn't started spinning yet, but the airplane has stalled and one of the wings has dropped. How should you recover? If you said the old PAIR acronym, you're wrong. Remember, we always have to break the stall first. Always, always, always break the stall first. 99.9% of the time, if you're quick to break the stall, the airplane won't even begin to spin, especially if you're flying a newer aircraft. Newer airplanes are designed so that they're very reluctant to spin. And even if you do start to spin, breaking the stall during the incipient phase of the spin is going to allow you to recover the aircraft in most cases. In fact, I've intentionally spun airplanes quite a few times during training. And this is one of the first things you'll notice when you start practicing spins. If you don't let the airplane get completely into the spin cycle, breaking the stall will recover the aircraft 9 out of 10 times. This is one of the reasons why you aren't even required to take spin training when you get your private pilot certificate. You don't really need it. Whew. I just heard your grandma breathe a huge sigh of relief. She must be nervous about you doing spin training. Anyway, once again, always break the stall first, and then if that doesn't work, then you can use the old PAIR acronym. Keep in mind, every airplane is different, so it's extremely important that you know the specific spin recovery procedures for the aircraft that you're going to be flying. But as a general rule, the PAIR acronym works for almost all training airplanes out there. Actually, I like to use P-PAIR because the first step should always be to push the nose forward to break the stall like I just mentioned. But if that doesn't work, then you can go power idle, ailerons and elevator neutral, rudder opposite until the spinning stops, and then elevator up to bring the airplane back up to level flight. Once again, this is going to work for most airplanes out there, but be sure to check your POH. You never know when you might be flying an airplane that has slightly different procedures, and there are no do-overs. It's really important to do this right the first time if you ever need it. Now, the FAA is going to try to trick you on the test, and one of the questions that you could possibly see seems to contradict the Airplane Flying Handbook. Let me read you this really quick so you don't miss this one on the test. If an airplane spins to the right, which wing or wings have stalled? The left wing, the right wing, both wings, or neither wing? Neither wing? Really? Do you think I'm that retarded? Anyway, like I mentioned a second ago, the Airplane Flying Handbook says that one or both wings can be stalled in order for a spin to occur, but the direction of the spin depends on which direction the aircraft is yawed. Because of that, there seems to be no correct answer to this question. But the most correct answer is that both wings have stalled, and here's why. First, it does not matter which wing has stalled. The airplane can enter the spin in either direction. So the left and right wings by themselves are obviously the wrong answers. But remember what I said earlier. The wings of our training aircraft are twisted so that the wing roots are going to stall before the rest of the wing. So if one wing stalls, there's a 99.9% chance that the wing root on the other wing is stalled as well. So that's what they're talking about when they're saying that both wings are stalled. That's part of what causes the rotation during a spin. Both wings are stalled, but one wing is still creating a little bit more lift than the other. Remember, a stalled wing still produces some lift. It's just not enough to hold up the airplane. I know, this is a really dumb question, but hopefully this explanation will help you get it right when you take the official FAA written exam. And that's everything you need to know about spins. Grandma would be so proud of you. Go ahead and eat a cookie, and I'll jump on into the next topic. This is a good one. Next, we need to talk about how to control an airplane. If you can understand the basics of how an airplane is controlled by the pilot and how we use the flight controls to move the airplane around the three main axes of an aircraft, this is going to give you a really solid foundation for your flight training. Unlike a car or a truck, an airplane is able to move into three different dimensions. And it's able to move into these three dimensions because it rotates around its center of gravity on three different axes: the lateral axis, the longitudinal axis, and the vertical axis. We're going to be discussing each one of these in detail, but if you're taking notes, you're going to want to remember these for the written exam. And speaking of that, this podcast is an audio only version of my complete and totally free private pilot ground course on YouTube. But in order to take the FAA written exam, you've got to be endorsed by an approved instructor. So if you're going to be taking that written exam, you can buy the premium version of this ground course, which includes fun videos, an endorsement for the written exam, reading assignments, quizzes, and practice tests that'll ensure that you're completely ready to take that test. Because believe me, it's a bear. But don't worry, I'll get you ready, and that premium course will make doubly sure that you pass the exam with flying colors. And that's only $50 on freepilottraining.net. Look around, most courses are going to cost you closer to $300. But anyway, let's get back to talking about those three axes. Now, I briefly mentioned this a second ago, but it's important to remember that all three of these axes go through the center of gravity. And when your airplane moves, it rotates around the center of gravity on that axis. Right now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is the center of gravity? And in a nutshell, the center of gravity is a theoretical point where the weight of an aircraft is concentrated. In other words, if I were to hang an airplane on a string by its center of gravity, the airplane would be balanced perfectly and it would just stay like this as long as we didn't move any weight around. But if we move some weight up closer to the front, the center of gravity would move forward as well, and the nose would tilt down on you. But it's important to remember that the airplane doesn't actually balance on its center of gravity. It actually balances on something called the center of lift. And the center of lift is a theoretical point where all the lift that a wing produces is concentrated. In other words, this is the spot where we balance an airplane when we're flying. So, if we were to put the center of gravity directly beneath the center of lift, the airplane would just chill here perfectly balanced. But we don't do that. We actually put the center of gravity in front of the center of lift. So the nose of the airplane is actually really, really heavy. And I'll explain why we do that in a future lesson. But for now, all you need to know is that the airplane moves around the center of gravity on its three axes. So let's take a look at each individual axis. The first way we move an airplane is on its lateral axis. Some pilots refer to this as the pitch axis because we move an airplane around its lateral axis by pitching the nose of the aircraft up or down. Now, here's where things get kind of weird. By pitching the nose up and down, the aircraft is actually moving longitudinally around that lateral axis. Now, I've said this before, and I had a ton of people questioning that statement. Yes, the airplane moves longitudinally around the lateral axis. The aircraft moves perpendicular to the axis you're rotating on. Movement is always perpendicular to the axis. But how do we move our airplane around that lateral axis? Well, to pitch the nose up and down, we have to use the elevator, and to control the elevator on our aircraft, we have to use the yoke, or the stick if your airplane has one of those. Pulling back on the yoke raises your elevator, and by raising the elevator in flight, the tail is deflected downward, and that rotates our aircraft up around that lateral axis. If we push forward on the yoke, that lowers the elevator, and that deflects the tail upward, which rolls us down around that lateral axis. And that's how simple it is to move an aircraft longitudinally around its lateral axis. Now let's talk about the longitudinal axis. This is what most pilots refer to as the roll axis, and that's because we roll the airplane around that axis. Now remember, This axis goes through the center of gravity the entire length of the airplane. That's why we call it the longitudinal axis, but the actual movement is perpendicular to that axis, just like the other one we just talked about. So, when an airplane moves around its longitudinal axis, it's moving laterally around that longitudinal axis. Have I confused you yet? Grandma looks really confused. I hope you're not. I want you guys to get this. We're going to be building on all this information throughout the series. Now, how do we move laterally around that roll axis? What controls do we need to use? Yes, the ailerons are what we use to move the airplane around that roll axis. Just like the elevator, the ailerons are one of the primary flight controls that we use as pilots to control the aircraft. And ailerons are kind of interesting. These are tied together in such a way that by rotating the yoke, one aileron is raised while the other one is lowered. The aileron that is lowered creates more lift, while the aileron that is raised creates less lift. This in turn rolls the aircraft in whatever direction the pilot wants. We'll talk more about this in a future lesson, but for now, all you need to do is remember that the ailerons roll the aircraft around the longitudinal axis. Last but not least, let's talk about the vertical axis. And some pilots refer to this as the yaw axis. Yaw is simply another word for a side to side or a twisting motion. And an airplane moves side to side or yaws around its vertical axis. Now, I do want to mention that yawing the airplane is not the way we turn an aircraft. I'll be explaining this more in a future lesson, but it's important to remember that the yaw axis is controlled by using the rudder pedals, and the reason we have rudder pedals is to maintain directional control of the aircraft. And the reason why we need to do this is because of something called adverse yaw. Remember what I said earlier about the ailerons? Ailerons are what we're going to be using to turn the airplane, and we do that by rolling around that longitudinal axis. When we rotate the yoke, one aileron moves up and the other aileron moves down. Not only does this roll the airplane, but something else happens as well. Anytime an aileron is lowered, that wing has more drag on it, and because of this extra drag, the airplane actually yaws in the direction of that lowered aileron. This means that anytime you roll the aircraft, you should also be moving the rudder pedals as well. Rudder pedals are simple. When you push the right pedal, the airplane yaws to the right. And when you push the left rudder pedal, the airplane yaws to the left. This means that in order to keep the airplane aligned with its direction of travel, we must use the rudder with the ailerons. And this is how you do that. Anytime you roll to the left, you should also be putting in a tiny bit of left rudder. And when you roll right, you should be putting in a tiny little bit of right rudder as well. Keep in mind, this is also important when you're rolling out of a turn. So if I'm rolling out of a turn, I have to use right aileron to do that. This means I actually need to use a little right rudder to maintain that directional control. Now, you know you're doing this right if the ball of your aircraft is centered throughout the whole maneuver. If it's not, step on the ball to get the airplane back where it needs to be. Get ready to hear that again. Your flight instructor is going to be barking at you quite a bit about that ball during your training. And now your grandma knows about that ball too, so you better not let her down. And that is how you control an airplane. And for the last topic today, we're going to be talking about aircraft stability. Aircraft stability is one of the most important things you need to learn if you want to improve your flying abilities as a pilot. But for some reason, a lot of instructors will tell you that it's only something you need to know for the written exam. And then you can just forget it once you pass the test. But that is not true whatsoever. This is a very important building block if you want to properly learn to fly an airplane. But what the heck is stability? Well, stability is the ability of an aircraft to correct for disturbances in its equilibrium and return to its original flight path. Now, I know that this is a $10 definition, so for those of you who are kind of stupid like me, I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm flying an airplane and all of a sudden my nose gets pushed up by turbulence. If I'm flying a stable airplane, the airplane is going to want to pitch back down to its original flight path. I'll explain why that is in a minute, but it's important to remember that most training airplanes like a Cessna 172 or a Piper Cherokee are designed to be super stable. And that's because a stable airplane is easier to control. In fact, the C-130 is an extremely stable aircraft as well, so it's really not that hard to fly either. Keep in mind, some airplanes are designed to be less stable on purpose. One example of this is a fighter jet. Fighter aircraft are designed to be less stable so they can be more maneuverable. They can turn super sharp and they have the ability to change their direction at the drop of a hat. But aircraft like this are less stable and a lot harder to control. Remember that. A stable aircraft is easier to control. This could very well be a test question. Now, when we're discussing stability, it's important to remember that all three axes are considered when an aircraft is designed. And once again, these axes go through the aircraft's center of gravity, and the center of gravity has a lot to do with aircraft stability because of this. All right, when we're talking about stability, it's important to know that there are two different kinds of stability that affect these axes: static stability and dynamic stability. Static stability is the initial tendency of the aircraft after the equilibrium has been disturbed. In other words, what's your airplane's immediate reaction when you make a control input, or if you get pushed around by the wind or something and your airplane moves around one of those three axes? For example, let's say you're flying along and you pitch the nose of your airplane up to 5 degrees nose high. You use the elevator to move the airplane up around its lateral axis. What is the airplane's initial tendency? Well, if the airplane's initial tendency is to pitch back down, that means your airplane has a positive static stability. On the other hand, if your airplane's initial tendency is to continue straight ahead at that same 5-degree attitude, we would say that this aircraft has neutral static stability. This simply means that whatever control inputs you make, the airplane stays right where you put it. Or if the turbulence rolls your wings into a 5-degree bank, your airplane is going to stay banked right where it's at. But an airplane could be designed with a negative static stability. Most of you guys are never going to fly an airplane like this, but if an airplane has a negative static stability, it's going to keep moving whichever direction the control input was made. For example, let's say I yawed my airplane to the right with my rudder pedal. An airplane with negative static stability would have an initial tendency of continuing that yaw to the right, and then you'd be in a flat spin to the right. But once again, your training airplane is designed to have positive static stability, so this isn't really going to be a thing for you. But some airplanes, like the old F-14 Tomcat, would often enter into a spin because it was designed intentionally with this negative static stability that I'm talking about. Fighter aircraft are intentionally designed to have negative static stability so they can do crazy stuff in combat and all that jazz. I think I'll keep my stable airplane. Okay, so static stability is an airplane's initial tendency once the equilibrium has been disrupted. But now we're going to be talking about dynamic stability. In a nutshell, dynamic stability is an airplane's response to a change in the equilibrium over time. Remember, if an airplane has positive static stability, its initial tendency will be to go back towards its original position. But what happens after that is what determines its dynamic stability. Let's say we pitch the nose of our airplane up. We know that our training airplane has a positive static stability, so the nose is going to pitch right back down. But the nose doesn't pitch back down exactly where it was. Training airplanes are designed so that the nose moves down below its original position, but at a slightly shallower pitch attitude. And guess what? Our airplane is stable, so it's designed to pitch back up, and then down again, and then up, and so on. Now, if an airplane has positive dynamic stability, these oscillations are going to get smaller and smaller until they're completely unnoticeable. And this is a really good thing for training airplanes. Positive dynamic stability makes it super easy to get the airplane under control because we can use really small control inputs. And if we go too far, the airplane will eventually correct itself and go back where it needs to be. And that's why this lesson is so important. New pilots tend to not have a good understanding of dynamic stability, and because of that, they tend to over control the airplane. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but let's first talk about two types of dynamic stability that some airplanes have. Let's say we pitch the nose up again, but this time it moved itself back to a nose low attitude equal and opposite to the nose high attitude that you created. And then the nose pitched back up to the same position, and those oscillations never got smaller. The aircraft just pitched up and down into the same nose high attitude and the same nose low attitude. This is what we call neutral dynamic stability, and this isn't really something you want because anytime you did anything with the controls, the airplane would just oscillate the entire time after you made a control input. Another type of stability is called negative dynamic stability. This is what we'd call it if we made a control input and those oscillations just got further and further apart instead of getting smaller and smaller. Once again, this would not be desirable either because any tiny little bump or anything like that would make you go completely haywire within a few oscillations. So, we want an airplane to come back to its original position. That's going to make it easier to control the aircraft. Now, you're probably still scratching your head over all this, and that's because this training requires you to understand two different concepts at the same time. This in turn creates a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. First, you have to understand what stability is, but you're probably also wondering why your training aircraft is even stable to begin with. So let's talk about some of the design features of your training aircraft and how these features improve the stability of your training airplane. Keep in mind, each one of these axes has different design features that affect stability in relation to that particular axis. This might be a little confusing, so be sure you're listening closely to this segment. First, let's talk about how we get longitudinal stability in an airplane. Remember, an airplane moves perpendicular to the axis that it's rotating on. So, longitudinal stability is achieved by the proper balancing of the lateral axis. And once again, I like to call this the pitch axis because an airplane pitches up and down along the lateral axis of our aircraft. Now, in order for an airplane manufacturer to design an airplane that is longitudinally stable, that airplane must balance perfectly on its wing. But this is easier said than done. First of all, at which point on the wing must the aircraft be balanced? Once again, the wings are designed so that most of the upper surface creates lift, but that lift averages out to one main spot where the lift is concentrated. And as I mentioned earlier, this is what we refer to as the center of lift or center of pressure. And your airplane literally balances on this spot as if the aircraft is a basket hanging in the sky from this point. Now, the center of gravity is the spot where the average weight is concentrated. So, as you can imagine, if we were to place the center of gravity directly beneath the center of lift, everything would be balanced nicely. But airplane manufacturers don't do that. Instead, they put the center of gravity slightly in front of the center of lift so that the nose of the aircraft is intentionally heavy, and there's actually a really good reason for this. First of all, we do not care if the airplane is balanced when we're sitting on the ground. What we want is for the plane to be balanced while we're actually flying. And because of that, most airplanes are designed with a horizontal stabilizer on the tail, which actually produces a downforce while the airplane is flying. And the way it does that is by having a slightly negative angle of attack. I like to tell students that it's basically an upside down wing back there. Now, the center of gravity doesn't actually move, but the apparent center of gravity does move. And that's because the tail actually starts pushing down when you start picking up airspeed. And that creates a downforce which balances your airplane on its center of lift. In fact, did you know that you can actually adjust the amount of downforce that your tail is producing so that the airplane will be perfectly balanced for the speed that your aircraft is flying? Yeah, this is done through something called trim, and you're going to be using trim a lot when you start flying. Or you better be, anyways. Every time you change your speed, you should be adjusting the trim so that your airplane is properly balanced. And this causes your apparent center of gravity to be aligned with the center of lift. And if you fly with a balanced airplane, this is going to make it way easier to control your aircraft. Now, here's where things start to get really interesting. Once a stable airplane has been properly balanced, it will almost fly itself. In fact, if you understand this concept right now, you're going to be light years ahead of other student pilots when you actually get into the airplane and start your flight training. Let's say I'm out cruising around and I balance out my airplane properly with my trim set to the speed that I'm flying. What will happen if I pitch the nose of my airplane down? Well, I'll speed up, won't I? That means that my tail will create more downforce. And if the tail creates more downforce, then the nose will pitch back up, won't it? And when that happens, if my airplane is trimmed properly, these oscillations will get smaller and smaller until I'm back to flying at a level attitude. And once again, this is called positive dynamic stability. So always keep your airplane trimmed up. That trim improves your dynamic stability on the pitch axis. Now, as you can see, the two things that affect our longitudinal stability are the center of gravity and the downward force that's created by the tail. We'll be talking about that more in the next lesson on controllability, but it's really important to know that longitudinal stability depends on these two things. Next, we have lateral stability, and lateral stability occurs along the longitudinal axis. Keep in mind, there are a few different ways that an airplane manufacturer achieves lateral stability when they design an airplane. But in this lesson, I'm only going to explain the two most common designs that you'll run into during your training, dihedral and the kill effect. Some airplanes are designed so that the outer tip of the wing is higher than the wing root. This is what we call dihedral, and this design is usually a little bit more pronounced on low-wing airplanes that can't take advantage of the kill effect. Let's say your airplane rolls to the left because of some turbulence that pushed up your right wing. When this happens, the wing is not lifted straight up. Instead, it's lifted in the direction of the turn. Because of this, an airplane will typically side slip into a yaw away from the direction of the roll. This is one of the things that causes adverse yaw. Now, we talked a little bit about this when we're talking about spins, but if you remember, I told you that the aileron that is lowered increases the drag on that raised wing. But that's not the only thing that causes your airplane to yaw away from the turn. The other thing that causes this is the horizontal component of lift. We'll talk more about this in an upcoming episode, but once again, when that wing gets picked up, this causes the wing to yaw away from the turn. If an airplane's wings were perfectly straight and you rolled the airplane would continue to roll past where you wanted to go, even after you move the yoke back to a neutral position. This is what happens when an airplane has negative static stability. There's nothing to keep the airplane stable and to move it back to its equilibrium. But in addition to that, the airplane would yaw away from the direction of the turn because of adverse yaw. And then it would just stay in a slip throughout the turn. But in most airplanes, especially low wings, they have a dihedral built into the wings. And this causes the wing in front, or the leading wing, to be at a higher angle of attack because of that extra angle in the wing design. Because of this extra angle, this leading wing is at a higher angle of attack, which means it will create more lift, which rolls us back to level flight. I know this can be kind of confusing since this lower wing is at a higher angle of attack, but this is made possible because of the wing shape and that dihedral angle. An airplane without that dihedral would not want to move back to its original roll attitude unless there were something else that caused it to do that. That's positive static stability. Dihedral gives the airplane that initial tendency to move back into position, and that dihedral angle is carefully chosen so if something causes your wing to roll, it's going to try and roll back, and those oscillations are going to get smaller and smaller until they're completely gone. And that's what we call positive dynamic stability. The next design feature that can increase an airplane's lateral stability is something called the kill effect. This is something that's only present in high wing aircraft, and the way the kill effect works is very similar to the pendulum on an old clock. What? You don't know what that is? Oh boy. Grandma looks really disappointed right now. Well, since you don't know, let's say you tied your cell phone on a string and swung it upward. What would happen to your phone? Yeah, it'd move back down, wouldn't it? The same thing happens in a high wing aircraft. Remember, an airplane balances on its center of lift. And when you look at an airplane from the front, the center of lift is actually concentrated up at the top of your aircraft in the center of the wings. Unless, of course, you're stupid and you put way too much weight on one wing or something. That can happen, by the way, especially in bigger airplanes with lots of fuel. Anyway, the center of lift is up here at the top of the aircraft, and the airplane's center of gravity is somewhere down closer to the middle. And once again, the airplane balances on this center of lift. So if we roll the aircraft, the weight is shifted up. But what goes up must come down. And that means that this weight at the bottom of the aircraft will try to bring the airplane back down to level flight. And this tendency to go back to level flight is something known as the kill effect. All right, last but not least, we need to talk about directional stability. And directional stability mainly affects the yaw axis. Once again, we want our training aircraft to be stable, so airplane manufacturers design these airplanes so that they will have good directional stability. And they do this by installing a vertical stabilizer of some kind or fins on the back of your aircraft. This in turn causes something called the weather vane effect. Anytime the vertical stabilizer is not aligned with the relative wind will push the tail back into position, a lot like a weather vane. And it's a really simple concept, but it works really, really well to achieve vertical stability along the yaw axis. Now, you might be asking yourself, why should I care about all this stuff? In fact, I can guarantee you that some of your flight instructors are going to tell you guys that this is something that you need to know for the written exam, but then you could just throw it out the window once you start your flight training. Do not do that. If your flight instructor tells you this, tell him that Josh says he's retarded. This is something that will really help you to understand how to control the airplane. And that's because new pilots tend to over control the aircraft when they're first getting started. This is because they don't understand that anytime you move the controls, a stable airplane is going to try and move back to its original position. And if you know that, you'll be ready for it and adjust your controls accordingly. In fact, if you watch an experienced pilot control an airplane, what you'll notice is that anytime they move the controls, they typically move them in the opposite direction soon after to keep the aircraft oscillations to a minimum. But for most folks getting started, they wait until the stability of the aircraft moves them back to the other side of the control input, and then they use the controls to get the airplane back into position. But had they just taken their hands off the controls, these oscillations would have just gotten smaller and smaller because the training aircraft has great dynamic stability. And when you over control an airplane like this is what we call a pilot induced oscillation. Pilot induced oscillations are almost always caused by a poor understanding of aircraft stability. That's why you can tell your instructor that he's a dingleberry if he says that this is not an important lesson. But do it with love, lots of love. Hey, I want to thank you for listening to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to check out freepilottraining.net if you need that endorsement for the written exam. And if you haven't seen my YouTube channel, you can just search for Free Pilot Training and look for the red Yeti. It's a Yeti because there's no such thing as Yetis, just like there's no such thing as free pilot training. Yeah, right. Thanks again for listening. See ya.